The moment Tobias Donovan stepped through the gate of her property, Lydia Ford felt every nerve in her body go rigid with something she could not name. It was not quite fear. It was not quite hope. It was the violent collision of both, slamming into her chest like a fist through glass. She stood on the porch of the farmhouse, her hands still dusted with flour from the morning bread, her hair half pinned and half fallen around her face, and she watched the man walk toward her with the slow, deliberate gait of someone who had been walking a very long time and was not entirely sure the ground beneath his feet was solid anymore. He was not a large man, but he carried himself with the kind of careful weight that told you he had seen things that changed a person permanently. His coat was worn thin at the elbows, his hat so weathered it had lost its original shape entirely, and his boots had been resoled at least twice by someone who was not a cobbler. One hand hung loose at his side. The other gripped a battered saddlebag that looked nearly as exhausted as its owner. The harvest was already behind schedule. 3 of her 4 seasonal workers had walked off the property the week before, lured away by the silver mines opening up 40 miles east near Calder Creek. The 4th, old Pete Whitmore, had broken 2 fingers on his left hand trying to fix a snapped wheel spoke and could barely grip a coffee cup, let alone a scythe. The wheat stood in her fields golden and trembling in the September wind of 1878, and every hour it stayed uncut was an hour it risked the early frost the sky had been threatening for days. Lydia had been watching that sky the way a person watches a slow fire. She needed help desperately, and every part of her knew it. And every part of her also knew that a woman alone on 40 acres outside of Millhaven, Kansas, did not simply open her gate to a stranger who arrived unannounced and looked like the world had been chewing on him for years. She had learned that lesson. She had learned it the hard way, in ways that still surfaced in her sleep sometimes, still made her reach for the shotgun she kept propped beside her bedroom door before she was even fully awake. But the man stopped at the foot of her porch steps and removed his hat, and she saw his face clearly for the first time, and something in her chest made a sound she did not have a word for. He was perhaps 30 years old, possibly a year or 2 either side of that. His face was angular and weathered, the kind of face that the sun and wind had been sculpting for a long time. He had dark eyes, the color of the earth after rain, and those eyes held something raw and honest in them that almost hurt to look at directly. There was a fading bruise along his left jaw that told of recent trouble, and his lip had been split not long ago, the cut still pink at the edges. He looked at her steadily and he said, his voice low and rough from disuse, "I cannot pay much, but I can work all day." Lydia Ford stared at him. The wind moved through the wheat behind her farmhouse, and the sound of it was the only thing in the world for a long moment. "Who are you?" she finally said. "Tobias Donovan," he said. "I am not trouble, ma'am, though I understand why you would think otherwise." She kept her hands visible, kept her expression level, kept every trained instinct of caution right where it belonged at the front of her mind. But she looked at that bruised jaw and those honest dark eyes and those boots resoled by someone who was not a cobbler, and she thought about the wheat standing in her fields trembling in the September wind, and she thought about the frost that was coming. "You know how to cut wheat?" "Yes, ma'am." "You know how to bundle and stack?" "Yes, ma'am." "You know how to keep your head down and do what you are told and not cause problems on my land?" Something moved through his expression then, not offense, not anger, something quieter and more complicated than either of those things, something that looked almost like recognition. "Yes, ma'am," he said again, "that I know very well." She looked at him for another long moment. Then she said, "There is a bunkhouse out back. It is not much. There is a cot and a blanket. You will take breakfast at 6 and dinner at 7, and you will earn your meals and whatever small wage I can spare at the end of the week. You will not come to the main house uninvited. You will not touch anything that is not yours, and if you give me one single reason to regret this, I will put you off this property so fast your head will spin." "Understood," he said. "What happened to your face?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Difference of opinion," he said finally. Lydia looked at him one more time. Then she turned and went back inside to finish her bread, and she did not look back, and she told herself very firmly that she had made a purely practical decision, and that there was nothing else in it, nothing at all. She was not entirely convincing, even to herself. Tobias Donovan had arrived in Millhaven, Kansas on a morning in mid-September 1878, with 43 cents in his pocket, a saddlebag containing 2 shirts, a razor, a dog-eared copy of a collected edition of poetry that had belonged to someone he did not like to think about, and a secret that he had been carrying for long enough that it had started to feel like it was made of stone. He had not planned to stop in Millhaven. He had not planned to stop anywhere. That had been the nature of the last 2 years of his life. He moved and he moved and he moved, and every town was a place he was passing through, and he kept moving because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant remembering, and remembering meant facing things he was not yet ready to face. But in Millhaven he had run out of money 3 days before his horse, a steady gray mare named Augusta, threw a shoe and went lame on the road outside of town. He had walked Augusta to the livery, and the livery man, a stout fellow named Amos Grice, had looked at the horse and looked at Tobias and quoted a price for the shoeing and the care that was so far beyond Tobias's current means that it might as well have been quoted in a foreign language. Tobias had 4 cents to his name by the time he found the livery. He left Augusta in Amos Grice's care, promising to pay in full when he had the money, and Amos Grice had looked at him with the particular skepticism that livery men who had been cheated before reserved for drifters who arrived on lame horses with empty pockets, but he had taken the horse. There was something in Tobias Donovan's eyes that made it hard to simply turn him away. Tobias had spent that night in the hayloft above the livery, which Amos Grice had allowed largely because the temperature had dropped sharply, and the man had a soft heart underneath the skepticism. Tobias had stared at the underside of the roof and listened to Augusta shifting in her stall below and thought about the fact that he had been a fool. He had been a fool in so many directions, and for so long that it had become a kind of defining quality, and he was 30 years old and he had 43 cents and a lame horse and a secret made of stone, and he needed to figure out what he was going to do next. In the morning he walked into town and stood at the corner of Main Street and watched Millhaven wake up, and he listened, the way he had learned to listen over years of drifting, for the current of information that always moved through a small town in the morning. Who needed what? Where the trouble was, where the opportunity might be hiding if you knew how to look for it. And what he heard, from a cluster of men talking outside the general store, was that the Ford widow out on the Millhaven Road had lost most of her harvest crew to the silver mines, and was in a bad way with the wheat still standing and the frost coming, and that nobody locally was particularly inclined to help her, because Lydia Ford had a reputation for being proud and difficult, and for not asking for help even when she needed it desperately. And several people had offered and been turned down flat, and at this point the general assumption in Millhaven was that she was going to lose her harvest and have a very hard winter, which was a shame, but what could you do? Tobias had listened to all of this without expression. Then he had walked to the edge of town and turned onto the Millhaven Road and started walking. He told himself it was purely practical. He needed work. She needed workers. It was a straightforward transaction. He was not doing it for any reason except that he needed to eat and earn enough to pay for Augusta's shoeing and get back on the road. He told himself this all the way down the Millhaven Road and through the gate of the Ford property. He told himself this right up until the moment he saw Lydia Ford standing on her porch with flour on her hands and her hair half fallen around her face, and something happened in his chest that had not happened in a very long time. Something that frightened him considerably more than it should have. The first day of the harvest was the hardest thing Tobias Donovan had done in recent memory, and he had done some hard things. He was in the field before the sun was fully up, which was before Lydia had told him to be, which she noticed from the kitchen window while she was making the breakfast. He had found the scythes in the barn without being told where to look, had checked the edges and sharpened the one that needed it, and was already cutting by the time she came out to call him in for the meal. She stood at the edge of the field and watched him work for a moment before she called out. He moved with the kind of rhythm that came from genuine experience, not the halting, choppy movements of someone who had been told how to scythe wheat but had not actually done it very much. He knew what he was doing. His whole body was engaged in it, and despite being clearly underfed and travel-worn, there was a strength in him that showed in the work. "Breakfast," she called. He straightened, turned, and walked toward her. He had taken off his worn coat and rolled his sleeves to the elbow, and she could see the long muscle of his forearms and the particular set of his shoulders that spoke of someone who had done physical labor for most of his life. She looked away and went back to the house. At the table, over fried eggs and biscuits and coffee that was better than anything Tobias had tasted in months, they did not speak much. Old Pete Whitmore sat at the table too, his bandaged hand held carefully, eating with his good hand and watching Tobias with the frank, evaluating look of an old man who had been around enough people to think he could read them quickly. "Where you from?" Pete said. "Missouri originally," Tobias said. "Long way from Missouri." "Yes, sir." "What brings you out this way?" Tobias looked at Pete with a mild expression. "The road," he said. Pete made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "Where you headed?" "West," Tobias said. "Everybody's headed west," Pete said. "What specifically?" "I have not worked that out yet," Tobias said, and there was something in his voice when he said it, a flatness that was not quite sadness and not quite resignation, but lived somewhere in the neighborhood of both, and Pete heard it and looked at him a little differently after that. Lydia refilled Tobias's coffee without being asked, and Tobias said thank you, and she said it was nothing, and that was more or less all they said to each other over breakfast. When he went back to the field, she stood at the kitchen window for longer than she intended to, watching him bend back to the work with that steady, powerful rhythm. Then she told herself very firmly to go and do something useful. The days fell into a pattern. Tobias rose before the sun. He was in the field by the time Lydia rang the iron triangle for breakfast at 6. He came in, ate quickly and with evident appreciation for the food, drank his coffee, answered Pete's conversational questions in monosyllables that were nonetheless somehow not unfriendly, and went back to the field. He worked until the light was gone. He ate dinner with the same quiet efficiency. He thanked Lydia for the meal every single evening with a sincerity that was not performative. That was the sincerity of someone who genuinely could not take food for granted. Then he went to the bunkhouse. He did not try to linger. He did not impose himself on her space. He did not make demands. He simply worked, with a relentlessness and a focus that started to change the look of her fields with visible speed. By the end of the second day, she was forced to acknowledge privately that at the rate he was working, he might actually save her harvest, or at least a significant portion of it. On the third day, Pete came out to the field in the afternoon, his bandaged hand tucked against his side, and watched Tobias work for a while. Then he said, "You want some company." "I would not mind it," Tobias said, not stopping. Pete settled himself on the fence at the field's edge and they talked, slowly and with long, comfortable silences between the talking, about the kind of things that men talk about when they are in no particular hurry. The weather, the state of the roads, the price of feed, the particular character of the Kansas sky in autumn. Tobias asked Pete how long he had worked for Lydia Ford. 6 years, Pete said. Since her husband passed. Tobias's scythe kept its rhythm. She has been managing this place alone for 6 years. With help, Pete said. But yes, largely, she is something Lydia Ford. She does not let much stop her. What stopped her husband? Tobias said. Fever, Pete said. Summer of 72. He was a good man. Robert Ford, solid, quiet, steady. They were well matched, those two. She grieved him something fierce, though you would not know it to look at her. She is not one for letting things show. Tobias said nothing, but something moved in his jaw. She runs this place better than most men would, Pete said. Better than Robert did, truth be told, and he was good at it. She has a gift for it, The land, the crops, the animals, she understands them. She does, Tobias said, and there was something in his voice that made Pete look at him sidelong. You got family somewhere, Pete said. Tobias was quiet for a moment. No, he said. That a recent development or an old one? Tobias looked up from the wheat and across the field, across the wide, flat Kansas landscape to where the horizon met the sky in a long, straight line, and he said, old enough, and left it there. Pete was a wise enough old man to leave it too. On the fourth evening, Lydia brought supper to the bunkhouse instead of calling him in, because the rain had started and she did not see the point in making him walk through it. She stood outside the door and knocked, and when Tobias opened the door he looked surprised in a way that he quickly controlled, and she stepped inside and set the plate on the small table and turned to go. Miss Ford, he said. She turned back. Thank you, he said, and then after a pause, for all of it, not just the meal, she looked at him in the lamplight of the bunkhouse. The rain was coming down steadily outside, drumming on the roof, and the small space felt both very close and somehow private in a way that made her aware of things she did not particularly want to be aware of. You are earning your keep, she said. More than earning it, honestly. Still, he said. She looked at him a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Then she said, Good night, Mr. Donovan. Good night, Miss Ford, he said. She walked back through the rain to the farmhouse and stood in her kitchen and pressed both palms flat against the cool surface of the table and took a long, slow breath and told herself that what she was feeling was gratitude. Simple, practical gratitude for a man who was working hard at a critical time. It was a reasonable enough story. She nearly believed it. On the fifth day, the trouble arrived in the form of a man named Curtis Hadley. Lydia was in the barn checking on one of the horses when she heard the sound of approaching hoofbeats, and she stepped out into the yard to find 3 riders coming through the gate. The man in front was Curtis Hadley, who was the kind of man who dressed expensively in a way that was meant to communicate power and mostly communicated something else. He was 45, broad-shouldered, with a thick dark mustache and pale eyes that had the quality of being calculating even when they were looking at something that did not require calculation. Curtis Hadley owned the largest parcel of land in this part of Millhaven County. He had been trying to buy Lydia's 40 acres for 3 years. The 2 parcels adjoined, and Lydia's land sat between Hadley's property and the creek that ran north to south about a mile west of town, giving it water access that Hadley's land lacked, and that would be extremely valuable to him. He had offered her fair prices twice, then unfair prices twice more, then veiled suggestions once, and then what she could only describe as a thinly veiled threat once, and she had said no every single time with increasing directness and decreasing politeness. She stood in the yard with her hands at her sides and watched him ride up. Miss Ford, he said, pulling his horse up and looking down at her with an expression that managed to be simultaneously friendly and condescending, which was a considerable feat. Mr. Hadley, she said, I heard you were having some trouble with your harvest crew, he said. Thought I would come by and see if there was anything I could do to help. There is not, she said. His pale eyes moved past her to the field where Tobias was visible, still working. Who is that, he said. A hired man, she said. I do not recognize him, Hadley said. He is new to the area, she said. Something shifted in Hadley's expression, something she did not like. You know anything about him, he said. Woman alone out here cannot be too careful about who she lets onto her property. I appreciate your concern, she said, with a tone that made clear she did not. Is there something specific I can help you with, Mr. Hadley? He looked at her for a long moment. Then he smiled, and the smile did not reach those pale eyes. I am simply going to put my offer on the table one more time, he said. $2,000 for the property. That is more than fair, Miss Ford. You could go somewhere easier. Somewhere you would not have to fight for everything. This land is not for sale, she said. It was never for sale. It will not be for sale. I would appreciate it if you would stop coming out here to remind me of offers I have already refused. The smile stayed on Hadley's face, but something underneath it went cold. That is a shame, he said. It would make things considerably simpler for everyone. "Good day, Mr. Hadley," she said. He looked at her for another moment. Then he turned his horse and rode back out through the gate with his 2 men behind him, and Lydia stood in the yard until the sound of hoofbeats faded and then kept standing there a moment longer, because her knees were not entirely steady and she needed a moment. She had not heard him approach, but Tobias was behind her. "That man wants something," he said. "My land," she said, "and he is used to getting what he wants." "Yes," she said. "Has he made threats?" She turned to look at him. His dark eyes were steady on her face, and there was something in his expression that was not quite anger but was in the same territory, something protective that he was not quite managing to keep below the surface. "He has made suggestions," she said carefully. "What kind of suggestions?" "The kind that are not quite threats but are not quite not threats either," she said. Tobias was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You should not be alone out here." "I have been alone out here for 6 years," she said, with a sharpness that was partly directed at him and partly at herself for the way she had felt when she realized he was standing behind her, and it had been the steadiest she had felt all morning. He held up a hand. "I am not saying it as a criticism," he said. "I am saying it because that man is the kind of man who watches to see when someone is most vulnerable. And right now, with your harvest crew gone and your harvest half in, you look vulnerable even though you are not." She looked at him for a long moment. Something in his assessment was so precisely accurate that it was almost uncomfortable. "He knows the town," she said. "He has friends everywhere, the sheriff included." "Of course he does," Tobias said, with the quiet certainty of someone who had encountered this particular arrangement before. "Men like that always do." "What would you suggest?" she said, and she was not entirely sure why she was asking him. She had not asked anyone for advice in a very long time. "Finish the harvest as fast as possible," he said. "Get it in. Once the wheat is in and sold, you have money in your pocket and the immediate vulnerability is gone." "I know that," she said. "I know you know it," he said. "I am saying let me help you do it faster." She looked at him. "I can work longer hours," he said. "Start earlier. If Pete can manage some of the lighter work with his good hand, we can move faster." "You are already working longer hours than I am paying you for," she said. "You are feeding me," he said simply. "And right now that is considerable." Something in the simplicity of this, the absolute unaffected directness of it, hit her somewhere behind the sternum. "All right," she said. They went back to work. That evening after dinner, Pete went to bed early and Lydia and Tobias sat on the porch for a while. Not by design, but because she came out to check the sky for weather signs and he was already there, leaning on the rail and looking out at the dark fields, and it would have been awkward to make a production of leaving. So they sat. There were 2 chairs on the porch, plain wooden ones she had made herself the second winter after Robert died, when she had needed something to do with her hands on the cold evenings. The sky was very clear and very full of stars, the particular density of stars that you only got out on the flat land where there was nothing for miles to dim them. "Haven is a good town," she said, not because she had decided to say it, but because the silence had gotten to a point where saying something felt easier than not saying it. "It seems decent enough," he said. "It is mostly decent," she said. "Hadley notwithstanding, most people here are good people trying to manage something difficult." "That is most places," he said. "Is it?" "In my experience," he said. "You have had a lot of experience with places," she said. He glanced at her. "Too much, maybe." "Where did you start?" she said. "You're traveling." He was quiet for a moment. "Missouri," he said. "Near a town called Granton. I grew up there." "What took you away from there?" The silence this time was longer. She watched him out of the corner of her eye, and she could see the slight tension that moved through his shoulders when she asked the question. "Something I should have handled differently," he said finally. She did not push. She had lived long enough to know that some stories needed more than one conversation before they were ready to be told. "I was married," he said, and the words came out with the careful weight of something being placed down from a great height. 3 years ago. Her name was Clara." Lydia was still. "She died," he said, "in the winter of '76, childbed fever, our son with her." "I am sorry," Lydia said, and she meant it in the bone-deep way that only people who have lost people of their own can mean it. "After that I could not stay," he said. "Granton had too much of them in it, every corner, every street. I thought if I kept moving I would eventually get to a place where I could breathe without it hurting." "Did you?" she said quietly. He looked out at the stars. "I am working on it," he said. She looked out at the stars too, and they sat in the clear Kansas night with all those stars above them, and the dark fields around them and the weight of their respective losses between them, not speaking, and it was the most honest silence she had been in for a very long time. After a while she said, "My husband was Robert. He died of fever in '72. He was 34 years old and he had never been seriously ill a day in his life, and then the fever came in July and he was gone in a week." Tobias said nothing, but she felt the quality of his attention change. He was listening with his whole self. "We had been married 8 years, she said. "I was 26 when he died. Everyone expected me to sell the farm and go back to my family in Ohio. I had a sister in Cincinnati who was very kind about it. She wrote me 3 letters offering me a room in her house." "But you stayed," Tobias said. "This is my land," she said. "I chose it, I worked it, I understand it. Robert and I built this farmhouse together with our own hands, that wall there." She nodded toward the east wall of the house. "We cut those logs ourselves. I was not leaving it." "No," Tobias said. "I can see that you were not." She glanced at him and found that he was looking at her with an expression that was open and unguarded in a way she had not seen from him before, and she looked away because looking at it directly felt like looking at something that was not meant for her, even though she was quite sure it was. "You were brave," he said. "I was stubborn," she said. "Sometimes those are the same thing," he said. They sat on the porch for another half an hour without talking much, and when Lydia finally said good night and went inside, she lay awake for a long time in the dark, thinking about his wife named Clara and his son he had never named aloud, and the way he had said, "I am working on it," with the careful steadiness of someone working on something very hard. The next day they worked side by side in the field for the first time. Pete had come out and was bundling the cut stalks into sheaves, which he could manage reasonably well with one good hand, and Lydia had picked up a scythe and come into the field, which she could do perfectly well, having done it every harvest since Robert died. Tobias looked at her when she started cutting and said nothing, but something in the set of his jaw told her he had perhaps expected otherwise, and she felt a small private satisfaction at having confounded the expectation. They worked across the field from each other for a while. Then, as the morning progressed and the rhythm of the work established itself, they moved closer together without quite deciding to, the way 2 people who are working toward the same thing tend to do. She became aware of him in a way she had not intended to become aware of anyone. The sound of his scythe, the particular cadence of his breathing when he was working hard, the way he paused every so often to check the sky, reading the weather the way farmers do, with an instinct that had been built up over years of watching the same kinds of signs. "Rain by tomorrow evening," he said at one point. "I thought so too," she said. "We should push through today." "Agreed." They worked through lunch, which Lydia had not planned to do but which became obvious as the morning went on. She brought bread and cold beef out to the field at noon, and they ate standing up quickly, and went back to the cutting. By mid-afternoon they had a substantial portion of the remaining field done, and Lydia's back was aching in a way she was not going to mention, because she had decided to work the field and she was going to finish it. Tobias stopped beside her around 4 in the afternoon and said, "Drink this," and handed her the water canteen, and she took it because she was genuinely thirsty, and when she handed it back their hands touched briefly and she felt the roughness of his palm against her fingers and looked up to find him looking at her with an expression that was very carefully controlled. "Thank you," she said. "We are making good progress," he said. "Yes," she said. They went back to work. That evening, bone-tired and flour-dusty, and pleased in the quiet particular way that hard physical labor produces, Lydia sat at the kitchen table and did the accounts. She had the numbers in front of her and a candle burning and the house quiet around her, and she thought about the harvest and the money from the harvest, and about what would come after. She thought about Curtis Hadley and his pale, calculating eyes. She thought about Tobias Donovan's dark, honest ones. She told herself to stop thinking about the latter and focus on the former, which was the actual problem. Hadley was the actual problem. She had known for a year now that his patience was running out. The offer he had made today, $2,000, was higher than his previous ones, which told her not that he was becoming more generous but that he was becoming more desperate for the water access, which meant he was more likely to do something beyond making offers. She thought about what Tobias had said. He watches to see when someone is most vulnerable. She needed to not be vulnerable. She needed the harvest in. She needed the money from it. She needed to make the property improvements she had been putting off, the ones that would demonstrate to anyone watching that this land was being vigorously maintained and actively farmed, and that the woman on it was not going anywhere. She picked up her pencil and started writing a list. On the 7th day of his working at the Ford farm, Tobias Donovan made a decision that he had been avoiding making for several days, which was the decision to be honest about something. He had told Lydia about Clara. He had told her about the grief and the running. Those things were true, and he did not regret having told them. But there was another thing, the secret he had been carrying, the one that had started his running in the first place, and he had not told her that. And the longer he stayed on this farm, and the more honest their evening conversations became, the more the silence about it felt like something close to betrayal, even though she had no reason to expect his full history and he had no obligation to provide it. The thing was this. In Granton, Missouri, in the winter before Clara died, there had been a man named Holt Deegan who had worked at the mill where Tobias worked. Holt Deegan was not a good man. He was a man who took things that did not belong to him, and when Tobias had caught him taking money from the mill's strongbox, a substantial amount of money that belonged to the mill's owner, an old man who could not afford to lose it, Tobias had confronted him. Holt Deegan had not responded well to being confronted. Holt Deegan had, in fact, tried to frame Tobias for the theft. He had been partially successful. The mill owner had believed Holt's version of events, had fired Tobias and refused to pay him the wages owed, and had spent considerable time telling the story around Granton in a way that put Tobias in an unflattering light. Tobias had been furious. He had also been young and proud and less wise than he would later become, and he had done something that he had regretted ever since, which was that in his fury he had confronted Holt Deegan again, this time physically, in the street in front of witnesses. He had not hurt Holt badly. There was one punch thrown, and Holt had come off worse from it, which was objectively his own fault for having tried to frame an innocent man. But the law in Granton had not particularly seen it that way, and there was a warrant out for Tobias Donovan in the state of Missouri on an assault charge that he had been running from for 2 years. Not running actively, exactly. The warrant was small and local and unlikely to follow him to Kansas. But it was there, and it was part of why he moved and did not stop, and it was part of the weight he carried, the feeling that he had left things behind him in ruins, not just the grief but the reputation, the standing, the sense of being a man other people could trust. He thought about telling Lydia all of this. He turned it over in his mind while he worked and while he ate, and while he lay on the bunk in the small bunkhouse at night, looking at the ceiling. He was afraid. He recognized this as fear without much pride, but also without pretending otherwise. He was afraid that if he told her the full story she would look at him differently, and he did not want her to look at him differently because the way she currently looked at him was one of the things that made the mornings worth getting up for, and he was not ready to lose it. But carrying the hidden truth was starting to feel worse than the fear of disclosure. On the 7th evening he knocked on the farmhouse door after dinner, which he had not done before, and Lydia came to the door looking surprised. "Can we talk?" he said. She looked at him for a moment and then stepped back and let him in. They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where she kept her accounts, with a lamp between them. He told her everything. He told her about Holt Deegan and the mill and the money and the confrontation in the street and the warrant in Missouri. He told it plainly and without self-pity or excessive justification. He simply told what had happened and where it had left him. When he was done, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "You hit a man who had stolen from your employer and then lied to get you fired." "Yes," he said, "and you have a warrant outstanding in Missouri for it." "Yes." She looked at him steadily. "Is that the whole of it?" "That is the whole of it," he said. She was quiet for another moment. Then she said, "I will tell you something, Tobias Donovan. I have had men on this farm who lied to me about their qualifications. I have had men who stole from me. I have had a man who drank my husband's good whiskey and told me to my face he had not touched it. And I have had men who were perfectly honest about small things and deeply dishonest about large ones." She looked at him across the lamp. "What you have just told me makes you more trustworthy to me, not less," she said. "Because you told me, and because what you did, while foolish, was the act of someone who was angry about an injustice. I can understand that." He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his chest was doing something complicated that he was trying to manage. "You are a remarkable woman," he said quietly. "I am a practical woman," she said. "The warrant is in Missouri. You are in Kansas. You have done nothing here. I see no reason to be troubled by it." "You should know about the people you employ," he said. "And now I do," she said. "Thank you for telling me." He nodded. She looked at him a moment longer, and something was moving in her expression that she was working to keep neutral, not quite succeeding. Then she said, "You should probably get some sleep. We have a long day tomorrow before the rain comes." He stood and put his hat on and went to the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame and turned back. "Miss Ford," he said. "Lydia," she said, and then looked slightly surprised at herself for having said it. Something shifted in his expression. Something warm and careful. "Lydia," he said. "Thank you." "Good night, Tobias," she said. He went out into the night and she stood in the kitchen for a long while, and the lamp burned steady between the four walls, and she pressed her lips together and smiled a little and shook her head at herself. The rain came the next evening, as predicted, and it came hard. By then they had the wheat cut and bundled, and much of it stacked in the barn, and what remained in the field would have to wait for the rain to pass, but it would survive one good rain in good condition if they moved fast once it stopped. The storm lasted through the night and into the next morning. Lydia was up at 4 checking the barn, making sure the stacked wheat was dry and the animals were settled. She was crossing the yard with a lantern in the dark and the rain coming down hard when she saw light in the bunkhouse and realized Tobias was already up. She hesitated. Then she went and knocked on the bunkhouse door. He opened it immediately, fully dressed, clearly having not slept. He looked at her in the lantern light with an expression that shifted quickly from worry to something like relief. "I was about to check the barn," he said. "I just came from there," she said. "It is fine. The wheat is dry." He breathed out. "Good. You could not sleep," she said. "It was not really a question." "No," he said. She looked at him. The rain was loud on the bunkhouse roof, and she was standing in the doorway with rain coming down behind her and her lantern held between them. "Come to the house," she said. "I am making coffee." He looked at her. "There is no reason to sit here alone in the dark," she said. "Come have coffee." So he came. They sat at the kitchen table while the rain came down, and she made coffee and found the last of the ginger snaps she had baked the week before, and they talked. Really talked, the way they had been inching toward for days, and now with the storm outside and the warm kitchen around them simply did not resist any more. He told her about growing up in Missouri. His father had been a farmer too, a tobacco farmer, and Tobias had grown up knowing the land in the way farm children did, as the thing that dictated everything else. He had been the youngest of 3 sons. Both his brothers had stayed in Missouri when Tobias left. He had not been in contact with them for 2 years. She told him about growing up in Ohio. in a family that was not poor but was never easy either, her father a blacksmith and her mother an extraordinary gardener who had taught Lydia everything she knew about growing things. She had come west with Robert at 21, which everyone in her family had thought was reckless, and she had loved it from the first day she saw the Kansas sky. "That sky," she said. "The first time I saw it, the scale of it. In Ohio, everything is trees and hills, and the sky is just a piece of blue between the tops of things. Here it is the whole world." "Yes," he said, and the way he said it told her he understood exactly what she meant. They talked about the farm, about what she had built and what she still wanted to build. She wanted to expand the wheat fields if she could afford it, and she wanted to add a proper orchard, apples and perhaps some pears, and she wanted to repair the east fence which had been in need of repair for a year. She had plans, specific and detailed plans, and as she talked about them she could see him listening with the attention of someone who was genuinely interested, not just being polite. He asked questions. Good ones. The kind of questions that showed he had been thinking about land and farming his whole life. They disagreed on something small, about the best timing for the second wheat planting, and the disagreement was animated and pleasant, and she found herself laughing at something he said with a spontaneity that surprised her. The laugh surprised him too. She could see it in his face, and she could see what the laugh did to him, how it moved through his expression like light through a window, and she looked down at her coffee cup because that look was doing things to her composure that her composure did not appreciate. The rain kept coming, the lamp burned warm, the ginger snaps ran out. They moved from coffee to the chamomile tea she kept for nights she could not sleep, and the conversation moved with them, slower now, quieter, the way conversations get in the small hours of the morning when the defenses are down and everything feels more honest. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes," he said. "When you said you were headed west, where specifically were you headed?" He was quiet for a moment. "I was not specific," he said. "I think I was headed toward something I could not name. Some version of starting over that did not require me to explain who I had been." She looked at him across the table, and now he met her eyes. The lamp between them and the rain outside and the quiet, honest truth of the small hours. "I'm less sure about the West," he said carefully. She held his gaze for a moment, then she looked down. "You should try to sleep," she said. "Rain will stop by morning and we will have the last of the field to bring in." "Yes," he said. He stood and picked up his hat. He looked at her, and there was something in that look that held a whole conversation they had not yet said out loud. "Thank you for the coffee," he said. "Thank you for the company," she said. He went back out into the rain. She sat at the table for a while longer by herself, in the lamplight with the rain on the roof, and she felt something that she had been trying not to feel for days settling in her chest like something coming home. As predicted, the rain stopped before dawn. The day after was clear and sharp, and they had the last of the wheat in the barn by noon. Lydia stood in the empty field and looked at the stubble and the clear sky and felt the particular bone-deep satisfaction of a hard thing finished. The harvest was in. It was not a record harvest, and it was not everything she had hoped for when the season started, but it was enough and it was in and she had done it. She looked at Tobias beside her. He was looking at the barn the way a craftsman looks at a finished thing with that quiet pleasure of work completed. She wanted to say several things. She said, "I could not have done this without you." He looked at her. "You would have found a way," he said. "Perhaps," she said, "but not in time. The frost would have taken the last quarter of it." He nodded slowly, accepting this. "Your wages are ready," she said. "More than we agreed because you worked more than we agreed." "You do not have to," he started. "I know I do not have to," she said. "I am doing it because it is right." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What will you do now with the harvest in?" "Take it to market." "Pay my accounts, start the fall work, repair the east fence." She paused. "The usual." "Right," he said. They stood in the harvested field and the September sun was warm on the stubble, and neither of them said anything for a moment about the obvious thing, which was what happened next. Whether he stayed or went. Whether the reason he had come, the purely practical transaction, was now concluded. She was not going to ask him to stay. She was aware that she wanted to, acutely aware of it, but she was not going to be the one to say it because she did not know what she was offering and she would not offer something she could not follow through on. He said, "I need to go to town. I owe Amos Grice at the livery for my horse." "Augusta," she said. He looked slightly surprised that she remembered. "Yes, she has been there 10 days. I owe him for the shoeing and the care." "Take the wagon," she said. "You can carry some of the wheat to market while you are in town." It was a practical suggestion. It was also a way of extending the interaction by approximately 3 hours. She was aware of both things. They drove to Millhaven together, which she had not quite planned but which was not unreasonable because she needed to speak to the grain merchant herself about prices, and she could do that while Tobias settled up at the livery, and then they could drive back together. This is how she explained it to herself. The truth was that she sat beside him on the wagon bench, with the horses moving at a steady walk on the Millhaven road and the morning air crisp and clean after the rain, and she was happier than she had been in a long time, and it was frightening, and it was wonderful in equal measure. At the grain merchant's, while Tobias was at the livery, she sold the first load of wheat at a fair price and had a conversation with the merchant, a man named Holland, about the second load she would bring in the following week. Holland was straightforward, and she had dealt with him for years, and the conversation was efficient and satisfactory. She was coming out of Holland's when she ran into Curtis Hadley. He was standing on the boardwalk with one of his men, and she was quite sure the encounter was not accidental because Hadley's pale eyes went to the grain merchant's door before they went to her, and he smiled the smile that did not reach them. "Good morning, Miss Ford," he said. "Harvest is in, I take it." "Good morning," she said, and made to pass him. "I heard you found yourself a hired man," he said, "a drifter from out of town." She stopped. "I found myself a capable worker at a critical time," she said. "Do you know anything about him?" Hadley said. There was something in his tone that made her skin prickle. She said. "I wonder," Hadley said, and his voice took on that quality of friendly danger that she recognized and disliked. "If you know that there is a warrant outstanding on a man named Tobias Donovan in the state of Missouri." She kept her expression absolutely still. "That is not information I am sure how you came to have," she said. "I have friends in various places," Hadley said. "Miss Ford, I am genuinely concerned. A woman alone, employing a man with legal trouble following him." "Thank you for your concern," she said. "I consider the matter handled. Good day." She walked away from him at a measured pace that she was very proud of, because what she wanted to do was run to the livery and find Tobias and warn him, and the instinct to do that told her something about herself that she was going to have to think about later. She found him at the livery. He had paid Amos Grice and Augusta was saddled and ready, but he had not mounted. He was standing in the livery yard and he turned when she came in and immediately his expression changed. "What happened?" He said. "Hadley," she said, "he knows about the warrant." Tobias went very still. "He knows your name and the warrant," she said. "I do not know how." "It is not hard to find out," he said carefully. "If someone sends letters to Missouri and has connections there." "He said he has friends in various places," she said. They looked at each other. "I should leave," he said, and the words were flat and careful, the words of someone saying the thing they think is right and not the thing they want. "No," she said. He looked at her. "If you leave now you are running again," she said. "And the warrant stays and Hadley has won something and you have lost something, and I will not have it." "Lydia, the warrant is in Missouri," she said. "You are in Kansas. What Hadley is doing is using the information to threaten you, or threaten me through you, or both. If he wanted to use it legally, he would have spoken to the sheriff, not to me on the boardwalk." He was watching her with an intensity that was almost difficult to be under. "If you want to leave," she said, "leave. That is your choice and I will not try to take it from you. But do not leave because Curtis Hadley scared you into it." A long silence. "He did not scare me," Tobias said. "I know," she said. "Then make your choice on real grounds." He looked at her for a long moment and she looked back, and the livery yard was quiet and Augusta shifted in her bridle. "What are the real grounds?" he said quietly. "That is for you to determine," she said, though her heart was doing something significant behind her ribs. He was quiet for another moment. Then he said, "Can you use a hand with the east fence?" She breathed out. "Yes," she said. "I can." He nodded. "Then I am not going anywhere," he said. They drove back to the farm together in the wagon, and Augusta walked alongside tied to the back, and nobody said anything about what had just happened in the livery yard, and nobody needed to. Over the following 2 weeks, Tobias Donovan stopped being a hired hand in any practical sense, and started being something else that they did not name, but that shaped itself through the days in 100 small ways. He fixed the east fence, which took 4 days and which he did meticulously, with the attention of someone who understood that a fence is not just a boundary, but a declaration that the land behind it is tended and claimed. He repaired the barn roof where 2 shingles had gone soft, which Lydia had been putting off because it required getting up on the roof, and she had no one to steady the ladder. He built a better chicken coop to replace the one that had been listing to the left since a windstorm in the spring. He was good with his hands in the specific way of someone who has had to learn to make and fix things without much help. She worked beside him on many of these things. They fell into a partnership of work that was comfortable and efficient, each of them understanding what the other was doing and either helping or standing clear appropriately. Pete Whitmore, whose fingers were healing well, watched all of this with a satisfaction that he expressed only through the particularly knowing quality of his silence on the subject. The evening settled into something that both of them anticipated throughout the day without discussing the fact that they anticipated it. After dinner, most evenings, they sat on the porch. Sometimes they talked a great deal. Sometimes they sat in comfortable quiet and watched the sky move. Lydia brought out her mending sometimes. Tobias had taken to carrying a small notebook in which he wrote things, and sometimes on the porch he wrote in it, and once she asked what he was writing and he said, after a pause, "I am not sure yet. It might be letters, or it might be something else." "To your brothers," she said. "Perhaps," he said. "I have been thinking about writing to them. I have been thinking about a great many things." She did not ask what other things. She thought she knew, and the knowing was doing things to her that she had not given permission for. One evening in early October, he was fixing the hinge on the barn door when she came out with 2 cups of coffee and sat on the fence rail to watch him work, which she did not usually do. Watching him work was not her habit, and he looked up and saw her sitting there, and something in his expression changed in a way that he did not try to hide. He set down the wrench and straightened and came over and took the cup of coffee and leaned against the fence beside her. They were very close. The fence rail put her slightly above him, and it was not their usual geography, and the proximity was doing things to the air between them. "Tobias," she said. "Yes," he said. "I want to say something," she said. "All right," he said carefully. She looked at the barn door, not at him. "I have been alone on this farm for 6 years," she said, "and I have been fine. I want you to know that I have been genuinely fine. I have not been waiting for something or someone. I made a life here that is good, and I was satisfied with it." "I believe you," he said. "But," she said. Silence. She looked at him. He was very still, watching her with those dark, honest eyes. "But something has changed," she said, "since you came, and I am not sure what to do with that." He set his coffee cup down on the fence rail and turned to face her fully. He was very close, and she could see the grain of his skin in the afternoon light, the fading bruise on his jaw almost gone now, the careful attention in his expression. "I could tell you what I want to do with it," he said quietly. She held his gaze. He reached up and very slowly, with a deliberateness that gave her every opportunity to step back, touched her face. His hand was rough and warm against her cheek, and she did not step back. "Lydia," he said. Her name in his voice was different than it was in anyone else's voice, and it had been different since the first night she said it and meant for him to use it. "I know you are a man who does not stay in one place," she said. "I was," he said. "I am not sure that is still true." "What changed?" she said. "You know what changed," he said. She did. She looked at him, and she knew, and she was terrified, and she put her hand over his where it rested against her cheek, and he closed his eyes for just a moment, as though the touch of her hand was something he needed to be still for. When he opened his eyes, he said, "I do not want to be the kind of man who makes promises he cannot keep. I know what I am right now. I am a man with 40 acres of experience and an empty pocket and a warrant in Missouri and no fixed address. That is the whole of it." "That is not the whole of it," she said. "No," he said, "it is not. The rest of it is that I have not felt this way about anything in years, and I do not take it lightly." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "I am not asking you for promises. I am asking you to be honest with me, which you have been. Which is more than most." "What are you asking me for?" he said. She thought about this. "Time," she said. "Stay, work the fall with me, see what this is." Something moved through his expression, something that looked very much like relief and something that looked very much like joy, and he was not quite managing to keep either of them contained. "All right," he said. She smiled at him, a real one, the kind she did not give often, and he looked at it as though he wanted to keep it. He was still holding her face. She was still holding his hand. They were very close. He leaned forward and kissed her softly, briefly, carefully, and she kissed him back. And when they separated, he looked at her with that open, unguarded expression, and she thought that the broken man who had come through her gate 2.5 weeks ago with 43 cents and a lame horse, and a secret was not quite as broken as he had appeared, or perhaps was the kind of broken that was in the process of mending, and she thought that she might understand something about that kind of process. "I should finish the hinge," he said. "You should," she agreed. He stepped back and picked up the wrench, and she picked up her coffee cup, and she stayed on the fence rail while he finished the hinge, and neither of them tried to pretend the last 5 minutes had not happened, and both of them were quietly, privately remarkable in their happiness about the fact that it had. The fall work was the deepest of anything Lydia had experienced in years. Not because the work itself was different, the fall plowing and the cover crop and the winterizing of the barn and the preserving of the last kitchen garden harvest, but because Tobias was in it with her, and everything was changed by the simple fact of his presence and his partnership. They worked. They talked. They ate together, all three of them, Pete and Tobias and Lydia, and Pete's knowing silences became more knowing with every day and occasionally tipped into an outright satisfied look that he directed at nothing in particular, and both of them pretended not to notice. Tobias wrote a letter to his brothers in Missouri. He showed it to Lydia before he sent it. It was not a long letter. It said that he was in Kansas and that he was well and that he had been wrong to cut off contact and that he hoped they were all right. She read it and handed it back and said, "Send it." "What if they are angry?" he said. "They probably are," she said. "That is all right. Angry people can also be glad." He sent it. Curtis Hadley came back to the farm in mid-October, and this time he brought the sheriff with him, a stout man named Greer who had the look of someone who would rather be somewhere else, but who was present out of obligation to a man who paid his election expenses. Tobias was in the barn when they rode up. Lydia met them in the yard. "Miss Ford," the sheriff said, with the slightly pained expression of a man doing something he knows is not quite right. "I have been informed that there is a man on your property with an outstanding warrant in the state of Missouri." "Sheriff Greer," she said, "the warrant you are referencing is a minor assault charge in a county in Missouri. As I understand the law, which I have taken some trouble to do, an outstanding warrant in another state requires formal extradition proceedings to be enforced across state lines. Those proceedings require a written request from the issuing state and the approval of the Kansas governor. Has that process been initiated?" Sheriff Greer blinked. Beside him, Hadley's expression had gone carefully neutral. "I am not aware of any such proceedings," Greer said. "Then you have no legal authority to remove Mr. Donovan from this property," she said. "And if you attempt to do so without that authority, I will retain a lawyer from Topeka and make things quite difficult for everyone involved." Greer looked at Hadley. Hadley looked at Lydia with his pale eyes and something in his expression that was no longer friendly. "This is not over, Miss Ford," Hadley said. "I expect it is not," she said pleasantly. "Good day, gentlemen." They rode away. Lydia went into the barn and found Tobias standing very still just inside the door, having clearly heard the entire exchange. He looked at her. "You had better marry me," he said, and then looked immediately as though he had startled himself with his own words. She stared at him. "That was," he said, "not how I intended to say that. I had intended to say it differently. I had intended to be considerably more thoughtful about it." "When had you intended to say it?" she said. "Eventually," he said. "I had not quite worked out the timing." She looked at him for a long moment. He looked back at her with the particular expression of a man who has said something irreversible and is waiting to find out whether it is a catastrophe. "Is that a question?" she said. He straightened. Something in him collected itself, and he looked at her with the full directness of his honest dark eyes, and he said, "Lydia Ford, I came through your gate broken and owed and going nowhere in particular. And you fed me and trusted me, and showed me what it looks like when a person decides to stay in a thing even when it is hard. I have been in love with you since approximately the third day of knowing you, and I have been trying to be responsible about it, but I would like very much to ask you to marry me if you would consider it." She was quiet for a moment that lasted long enough to make him visibly nervous. "Yes," she said. He blinked. "Yes, yes," she said again. "That is what I said." He crossed the barn in 3 steps and kissed her properly this time, with all of the feeling that had been building for weeks, and she kissed him back in kind, and the horses in their stalls shifted pleasantly, and outside the Kansas sky was enormous and clear, and the fall light came through the barn door in a long golden bar. The business of the warrant needed to be sorted. Lydia had not been bluffing about the lawyer from Topeka. She wrote a letter to a legal firm she had heard of from a friend who lived in the capital, and the lawyer who replied, a man named Ferris, was thorough and practical. He looked into the situation in Missouri and wrote back with information that changed things considerably. The warrant had been issued at the instigation of Holt Deegan and was based largely on Deegan's account. However, Ferris had made inquiries and found that Holt Deegan himself had subsequent legal trouble, and the mill owner, in reconsidering things at a distance, had revised his account of events and was no longer certain of his original version. The original warrant was on weak ground, and there was a reasonable argument to be made for having it addressed. More importantly, Ferris pointed out, a man who was now a settled Kansas resident, employed and with community ties, was in a far stronger position to address the warrant legally than a drifter passing through. Tobias and Lydia discussed this at length over 3 evenings. Then Tobias wrote another letter, this one to Granton, Missouri, addressed to the mill owner. He wrote it with the care of someone who had thought about what he wanted to say for years. He explained what had happened from his perspective, clearly and without bitterness. He acknowledged the punch. He said that he understood why the mill owner had believed Deegan's version of events, but asked him to consider the facts of the situation and to speak to the relevant authorities. The mill owner, whose name was Samuel Hart, wrote back 6 weeks later. He wrote that he had done some reconsidering. He wrote that Holt Deegan had in fact been dismissed from the mill the previous year for similar dishonesty, and that Hart had come to believe the original picture had not been entirely accurate. He wrote that he would speak to the county sheriff about the matter. It took another 3 months and 2 more letters and 1 letter from lawyer Ferris, but in January of 1879, the warrant was formally withdrawn. Tobias read the letter at the kitchen table with Lydia beside him, and then he put it down and sat very still for a moment. And then he pressed both hands flat on the table and breathed out in a long, controlled exhale that told her everything about what he had been carrying. She put her hand over his and did not say anything. There was nothing that needed to be said. The winter of 1878 going into 1879 was a good one, which is to say it was hard in the ways that Kansas winters were hard but not cruel in the ways they could sometimes be. There was enough snow, enough cold, but no devastating blizzard, no catastrophic freeze, No ice storm that took the barn roof or froze the well. The farm weathered it well. Lydia had prepared well, as she always did, and this year with Tobias beside her she had prepared even better. The root cellar was full, the barn was weatherproofed, the animals were settled and well fed. They were married in November, 2 months after the harvest, in Millhaven's small white church on a Saturday morning, with Pete Whitmore as one witness and Lydia's nearest neighbor, a woman named Agnes Croft, whose farm was 3 miles east, as the other. The minister, Reverend Dell, performed the ceremony with a warmth that suggested he found it a particularly satisfying piece of business. Two people who were clearly and unmistakably in the right place with the right person. Lydia wore the blue dress that was her best, with her hair properly pinned for once, and Tobias wore a clean shirt and his coat with a new button on it, replacing the one that had fallen off somewhere in his travels, and Pete cried, though he denied this later to anyone who brought it up. The reception was modest, because it was what they could afford, but Agnes Croft brought a cake and 2 other neighbors came, the Hartley family from down the road, who brought good wishes and a jar of preserved plums, and it was genuinely, simply joyful. That evening they were alone in the farmhouse for the first time, and the fire was burning well in the hearth, and outside the November wind was picking up, and Lydia was standing at the window looking out at the dark fields when Tobias came up behind her and put his hands on her shoulders. She leaned back into him. "Lydia Donovan," he said quietly, testing the sound of it. "That is going to take some getting used to," she said. "Do you mind it?" he said. She turned to look at him over her shoulder. "Ford was Robert's name," she said carefully. "Donovan is yours. No, I do not mind it." He turned her gently to face him and kissed her forehead and then her mouth, and she pressed her hands flat against his chest and felt his heartbeat under her palms, steady and real. Outside, the wind moved across the fields and the fire crackled in the hearth, and the farmhouse held them both. The farmhouse with its east wall that Lydia had cut herself from logs she and Robert had felled, and the farmhouse was large enough for a new story, and they were going to tell it. Tobias's brothers replied to his letter in December, a joint letter written in his elder brother's hand. Their names were Francis and George, and their letter was warm and slightly tentative in the way of people who have been worried for a long time and are not quite sure what emotional register to land in when the worry is relieved. They were glad he was safe. They were glad he had found a place. They said their mother would have been happy to know he had married a farmer's widow in Kansas, because their mother had loved the land in the same way. They said they hoped to hear more and to perhaps visit in the summer if travel could be arranged. Tobias read this letter at the breakfast table and was quiet for a while after. Then he said, "I would like them to come, if you would not mind." "I would not mind at all," Lydia said. "I would like to meet them." He looked at her. "You are sure?" "Tobias," she said. "This is your home. Your family is welcome in your home." He looked at her with that open, unguarded expression that she was coming to know was the truest version of his face, the one underneath all the careful control, and he said, "I still cannot entirely believe this is real." "Eat your breakfast," she said, which was not a sentimental reply but which was, in her way, everything she was trying to say. He ate his breakfast. He was smiling while he did it. The spring of 1879 came with the particular ferocity of relief that Kansas springs had, after the gray and the cold, the sudden return of green and warmth, and the enormous sky full of clouds moving fast over the flat land. The planting was better that spring than any Lydia had managed since Robert died. Tobias knew what he was doing in the field, his childhood on the Missouri tobacco farm having given him a knowledge of soil and growth that translated well even to the different crop. And between the two of them, they planted more wheat than she had in any of the previous years, extending the field to the west where the soil was good and had been lying fallow. They also planted the orchard she had wanted. 6 apple trees and 2 pear trees from a nursery in Topeka, brought by wagon, planted along the south side of the property where the light was best. They were young trees and would not bear fruit for several years, but they were in the ground and they were growing. And every time Lydia walked past them, she felt the specific satisfaction of something invested in the future. Curtis Hadley, his immediate strategy having failed, appeared to have recalibrated. He had not come to the farm again, and Lydia heard through various channels that he had made an offer on a different parcel of land, further west, which had water access of its own. Whether he would eventually return to trying to pressure her was something she could not know, but the immediate pressure had eased, and with Tobias on the farm and the harvest strong and the money from the fall wheat in the bank and the warrant cleared, she was in a considerably stronger position than she had been in September. In June, Tobias's brothers Francis and George arrived from Missouri, two men in their middle 30s who looked like broader versions of Tobias, and who arrived on the farm looking around with the frank assessment of people who want to see if the situation matches the letters. Within an hour it was clear that it did. Francis, the elder brother, sat at the kitchen table with Lydia and talked about farming for 45 minutes with the enthusiasm of someone who had found a kindred spirit, which she was. George, who was quieter than his brothers and who had a gentle wit that surfaced unexpectedly, wandered the farm with Tobias, and she could hear them talking in the yard, and the tone of it was the tone of brothers reconnecting, careful and warm and gradually less careful as the afternoon went on. That evening they had a real dinner, the best she could produce, roast chicken and fresh bread and vegetables from the kitchen garden and the preserved peaches from the fall. And 4 people sat around the table in the farmhouse, and there was laughter in the farmhouse for the first time in a long while, genuine boisterous laughter over the kind of stories that families tell on each other. And Pete Whitmore, who had been invited, joined them and was at his happiest. Because Pete's deepest satisfaction was watching people be good together. Francis, by the end of the visit, had told Lydia she was the best thing that had happened to their family in years, which made her laugh and shake her head, and which she also privately held on to. George, on his last evening, sat beside Tobias on the porch after dinner and said, quietly enough that Lydia inside could not hear it through the window but could see the shapes of them talking, something that made Tobias look at him for a long moment and then nod slowly, with the nod of a man accepting something true. Later in bed in the dark, she asked him what George had said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said that he had been worried about me for 2 years and that seeing me here on this farm with you, the worry was gone, and that Clara would have wanted that she would have wanted me to stop running. Lydia was quiet. He knew her well, Tobias said. He probably knew her as well as anyone. She sounds like she was someone worth knowing, Lydia said carefully. She was, he said. She was a kind person. She would have liked you. They lay in the dark for a while. I carry them with me, he said. I do not think that will ever stop, but it is different than it was. It does not feel like something I am drowning in anymore. It feels like something I am carrying, and there is a difference. Yes, she said, there is. He found her hand in the dark and held it. I am glad I walked down that road, he said. So am I, she said. By the time the summer of 1879 was settling into its full heat, Lydia knew she was expecting a baby. She told Tobias one morning in July, standing in the kitchen, with the directness that was her nature and the slight unsteadiness in her voice that was her honest feeling. His face went through several things quickly. Surprise, which became something deeper than surprise, which became something that was close to the expression he had worn when she said yes in the livery yard, that open, unguarded joy that was the truest version of him. He crossed the kitchen and took her face in both his hands and looked at her for a long moment and then kissed her forehead with a tenderness that made her eyes sting, which she would not have admitted to anyone. Are you well? He said. Very well, she said. Strong as a horse. Lydia, he said. Tobias, she said. This is, he said, and stopped and tried again. This is something. Yes, she said, it is. He held her in the kitchen for a long while in the morning light, while the summer heat built outside and the wheat grew in the fields, and the young apple trees grew along the south fence. And she pressed her face against his chest and listened to his heartbeat and felt, with a certainty that was not based on any particular evidence but that was nonetheless entirely real, that they had arrived somewhere good and true, and that they were going to stay. Old Pete Whitmore, upon being told, said nothing at all for a full 30 seconds and then said, "Well," in a tone of such deep satisfaction that it served as all the eloquence in the world. The harvest of 1879 was the best harvest the Ford farm had produced in a decade. The extended field Lydia and Tobias had planted in the spring came in strong, the wheat full and golden, and they hired 2 proper hands from town for the harvest week, young men who were dependable and worked hard, and the whole thing was in the barn in 6 days. Lydia, 6 months along by September, did not do the scything this year, which she accepted with practical grace because the practicality was clear and she was not foolish. She managed the stacking and the bundling and the barn organization, and the cooking and the constant flow of decisions that a harvest required. And she did all of this with the steady competence that was simply how she operated. And Tobias beside her was not trying to manage her or soften anything, but simply working alongside her the way a true partner does. In the evenings of harvest week, they sat on the porch in their usual chairs, and she was tired in her bones but satisfied in that particular harvest-tired way. And he was tired in his bones too, and they watched the stars. And it was the same as the evenings a year ago, except that everything was different. "1 year ago," she said one evening. "Yes," he said. "You came through that gate with 43 cents and a lame horse," she said. "And a battered coat," he said. "And a secret," she said. "And a secret," he said. "And now," she said. "And now," he said. She looked at him. He was looking at her already in the way he had of looking at her when he thought she might not be looking back, which she almost always was. "I cannot think of a single thing I need that I do not have," she said. He reached across the space between the chairs and took her hand, his hand warm and rough against hers. "Nor can I," he said. Their son was born in November of 1879 in the farmhouse, with the help of Agnes Croft, who had experience with these things, and with the doctor from Millhaven who arrived on time and was a steady, capable man. The labor was long and hard, and Tobias spent most of it in the kitchen being systematically useless and knowing it, until Agnes put him to work keeping water hot and feeding wood to the stove, which gave him something to do with his hands. When the sound came from the bedroom, that specific sound that tells every father in the world that something enormous has just happened, Tobias went still in the kitchen and pressed both hands flat on the table and breathed. Agnes came to the kitchen door and said, "You have a son. She is fine and so is he. Come." He named him James Robert Donovan, the James for Tobias's father whose middle name it had been, and the Robert for the man who had built the east wall of this farmhouse and who had loved Lydia Ford before Tobias did, and who was, in some way Tobias felt clearly without being able to precisely articulate, a part of the story of this place. Lydia held the name for a moment when he said it, looked at him with an expression that was more complicated than he could fully read, and then said, "Yes, that is exactly right." James Robert Donovan was a serious baby who developed into a curious, energetic child with his father's dark eyes and his mother's will, which was a combination that made both of his parents laugh and despair in equal measure at appropriate intervals. The farm grew. Tobias invested himself in it with the wholehearted commitment of someone who had found the thing he was supposed to be doing, and Lydia's plans, the ones she had laid out on that rainy night during their first harvest week, were realized one by one over the years that followed. The orchard came into fruit in 1882, and the first apple harvest was a celebration in its own right. Something about fruit from trees you planted yourself carrying a particular satisfaction. Pete Whitmore lived on the farm until 1883, when his age finally caught up with his willingness, and he retired to town to live with his daughter. His leaving was marked with a dinner and a great deal of sincere feeling on all sides, and he came back to visit every few weeks on a borrowed horse, and the sight of his horse coming up the Millhaven road was always a welcome one. Curtis Hadley, It was eventually reported around Millhaven, had overextended himself on several land purchases and run into financial difficulties by 1881. He sold a large portion of his holdings, including the parcel adjacent to Lydia's, to a young farming family from Ohio named Birch, who were exactly the kind of neighbors that make a community generous and steady and good. Hadley himself left Millhaven County entirely. Where he went was no one's particular concern. Francis Donovan visited again in the summer of 1881 and fell into conversation with Agnes Croft, Lydia's neighbor, with a naturalness that both Lydia and Tobias observed without comment and with a great deal of private satisfaction. Francis returned to Missouri in the fall, but the correspondence between him and Agnes was remarked upon by various people in Millhaven who had nothing better to occupy themselves with. And by 1882, Francis had made his own journey west and was managing a lease on land near Millhaven that positioned him, conveniently, about 4 miles from the Croft farm. George Donovan wrote regularly and visited when he could, which was not as often as anyone wanted. He remained in Missouri, on the family farm which he had taken over when their mother passed, and he was content with it, or said he was. His letters were funny and warm and occasionally philosophical in ways that made Tobias laugh out loud and read passages to Lydia over breakfast. In 1883, when James was 3, and terrorizing the farm's chicken population with a focused enthusiasm, Lydia told Tobias she was expecting again. This time he was less surprised and no less happy, and this time the child, born in the spring of 1884, was a girl they named Ruth Agnes Donovan, the Agnes in honor of Agnes Croft, who had been at both births and was, by this point, as close to family as a neighbor could be. Ruth had her mother's gray eyes and her father's dark hair, and an opinion about everything from the moment she could form words to express opinions. And James, after an initial period of skepticism about the whole enterprise, became her devoted protector, which lasted approximately her entire childhood and beyond. The farmhouse expanded in 1884, a new room added onto the east end, which Tobias and Francis built together over one long productive summer, while Lydia and Agnes managed the farming and the children, and an elaborate running commentary on the quality of the construction that kept all parties entertained. By the time the summer of 1885 rolled around, the farm was something to see. The wheat fields were extensive and well managed, the orchard full and productive, the fences all in good repair, the barn solid and weatherproof, the farmhouse extended and solid, the kitchen garden producing abundantly. It was the farm Lydia had always known it could be, the farm she had refused to leave or sell or surrender, even when everything made that the harder choice. And on the porch on an August evening in 1885, Lydia Donovan sat in her usual chair and watched the enormous Kansas sky go from gold to orange to the deep indigo of early night, and Tobias was beside her as he always was, and James was inside the house doing something he had been told not to do and hoping no one would notice, and Ruth was asleep, having worn herself out being 3 years old. "Do you remember," Tobias said, "what you said to me, the first day I came here?" "I said a great many things," she said. "You said, if you give me one single reason to regret this, I will put you off this property so fast your head will spin." She laughed. "I did say that. I have spent 7 years trying to make sure you never had a reason to regret it," he said. She looked at him in the evening light. His face was not the face of the man who had come through her gate broken and thin and silent, or rather it was, underneath it was the same face, those same dark eyes, but there was a rest in it now that had not been there before, a settledness. "You have done considerably more than that," she said. "Have I?" he said. "Tobias," she said. "You came through my gate with 43 cents and said you could work all day, and you have been working all day ever since, and this farm and this family and this life are all the better for it. I have not a single regret, not one." He was quiet for a moment, and she could see him holding what she had said the way you hold something you do not want to put down. "Nor have I," he said. "There is not a single morning I wake up on this farm that I am not genuinely glad to be here." She reached over and took his hand, and he turned it and held hers properly, and they watched the last of the light go out of the Kansas sky, and the stars begin to emerge, the brilliant particular stars of the flat land where nothing stood between you and the full depth of the night sky. James called from inside the house, something about a cup of water, which was almost certainly not actually about a cup of water, but was the time-honored child's method of testing whether anyone was paying attention. "I will go," Tobias said, but he held her hand a moment longer before he stood. She held it back. Then she let him go, and listened to the sound of his boots on the porch boards and the screen door and his voice inside saying something to James that produced laughter, James's particular cackling laugh that was her favorite sound, and she sat on the porch in the warm August evening and breathed in the smell of the farm, the wheat and the turned earth and the faint sweetness from the orchard. And above her, the Kansas sky held more stars than she could ever count. And below them the land stretched out flat and wide and hers, truly hers, and the farmhouse with its east wall she had cut herself held her family, and everything that had led to this moment, the grief and the stubbornness and the 6 years of managing alone, and the morning in September 1878 when a broken drifter had come through her gate with nothing but his willingness and his honest dark eyes, had been exactly as it needed to be. She stayed on the porch a while longer because the evening was beautiful and she was not in a hurry. Then she went inside, to the warmth and the light and the sound of her family. The screen door closed behind her. Outside, the stars settled over the farm in their unchanging abundance, and the wheat rustled in the small night wind, and the young apple trees stood along the south fence, heavy with fruit, as they would continue to stand, growing steadily stronger for years and years to come.